February the 17th, 1979 came and, as we were all well aware, went. The world did, unfortunately for Roch, not end. Christ did not return and there was no salvation for the followers. Roch quickly concocted a story that due to God being, well, God, time passed somewhat differently for him than it does for a mere mortal man, and this had caused some confusion as to the exact date. The group could rest assured, however, as the end days were coming any time now. This yarn proved enough for most, but in April of 1979, Jacques Vissay left. Roch told the group he had been taken by the devil, and when Maurice Grenier talked to her husband of wishing to leave, Roch ordered her husband Jacques to cut off one of her toes with an axe as punishment. He promptly removed one of her small toes. April proved to be a trying month all round for Roch, as Chantal Labry's parents too obtained a court order to remove their daughter from the commune to undergo psychological evaluation. When the police showed up to remove her, Roch simply denied them access and saw them on their way. 4 days later, however, a Quebec newspaper published an article titled "They are happy and free to leave if they wish," which included an interview with Jacques Vissay, the recent deserter. 10 police showed up in a helicopter which landed on the Eternal Mountain, and they arrested Roch for obstruction of justice and ordered him also to take a psychological evaluation, which was to be carried out in a Quebec hospital named the Hospital of Robert Giffard. Roch not only aced his evaluation, he actually convinced his testers that he had saved his followers from a life of depravity and drugs. The director of the hospital actually took to calling him Moses and publicly expressed scorn for the poor treatment of Roch by a prejudiced society who was suspicious of his alternative lifestyle. Roch was released early and judged fit to stand trial for obstruction of justice, for which he was given a 1-year suspended sentence. During the trial, the media too began printing stories of Roch, portraying him as a victim of prejudgments. The whole affair only proved to strengthen the ties between Roch and his followers, and when long-term MS sufferer Gabrielle Nadeau fell into a coma and died shortly after his return, and the authorities denied Roch from burying her at the foot of the mountain, instead removing her body for autopsy, Roch used both events to strengthen the us versus them mentality he had been carefully fostering. Gabrielle's autopsy later returned no evidence of foul play. In November of 1980, Guy Vere made his way out to Eternal Mountain and joined the group. Vere had met Roch in the Hospital of Robert Giffard and read about Roch in the media. He had been undergoing treatment at the hospital for depression, and as an outsider he was permitted to join under certain conditions. Gabrielle, the group's nurse, examined him, and once he was judged fit, Roch permitted him to stay in his storage shed. He was given a small wooden stove, 24 bottles of homebrew beer, 2 hens, a rooster and 1 meal per day. He was essentially taken in as a slave and forced to chop wood and undertake cabin construction, as well as babysit for the 3 children of the commune who were not fathered by Roch. All the while, Roch maintained his outsider status. On March the 23rd, 1980, Roch organised a large party for the group. Something special was happening. His 2 sons from his first marriage, Roch Jr., now 12 years old, and Francois, now 10, were coming to Eternal Mountain to live. Vere was, unsurprisingly, not invited. That same night, Roch decided that Maurice's son, one of the outsider children, needed to be circumcised. Using a blade and a 94% ethanol solution for sterilisation, he took it upon himself to see the job done. At the same time, he administered the ethanol solution orally to the infant as an anaesthetic. The next morning, Samuel was found dead. Roch feigned concern that if Samuel's body was buried, it may be dug up by animals, and he suggested a cremation, and the group agreed. After 6 months of barely tolerating Vere's presence in the group, Roch had had enough, and on the 14th of September, he concocted a story involving Vere beating Samuel to death, and demanded that he now stand trial for his misdeed. Roch set up a mock trial complete with coroner, prosecution, defence and jury. Samuel's father Jacques was appointed judge, and after an hour's deliberation his verdict was passed. Vere was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Roch was wholly unimpressed by this outcome, and he took Jacques aside and suggested Veer to be castrated. The group put it to vote, and 7 voted for the motion, while Jacques, Maurice and Giselle voted against. Despite this reluctance by Samuel's own parents, democracy had spoken, and Roch set about talking Veer into submitting to the verdict voluntarily. He suggested to Veer that as a eunuch, his headaches that he had been complaining to Roch about previously and his masturbation habits would both be cured. Not only that, but it would see Veer promoted above the station of group slave. He then made Veer write a letter of consent and finally left the decision on whether or not to sign the letter in Veer's own hands. He signed. Roch carried out this surgery on the kitchen table. This consent was obviously limited, however, as on the 5th of November he fled to the nearby town of St. Jogues and spilled the story of Samuel's death. However, he changed the facts, claiming he was kicked by a horse. Even after everything he had suffered under Roch's hand, he was unable to turn him in. Nevertheless, Veer's testimony was enough for police to raid the commune. Members of the group protested, parroting the story that Veer himself had beaten Samuel to death, but police went ahead and arrested Roch, Jacques and Maurice. The coroner found the group to be criminally responsible, and during their trial, verdicts were passed. Roch, Jacques, Maurice, Gabrielle and Veer were charged with criminal negligence causing bodily harm, whilst Claude was charged with obstruction of justice. Jacques, Maurice, Claude and Solange were further charged with neglect towards their children, and Roch and Gabrielle were charged with bodily harm with intent to mutilate for their work on Veer's castration. All of the accused pleaded not guilty, and all were unsuccessful in their defence. The group's children were distributed into foster homes throughout Canada, and on September the 29th, 1982, their sentencing was passed. Jacques, Maurice, Claude, Solange and Veer were all released on the condition they were not to return to Eternal Mountain. Roch and Gabrielle, however, were denied bail, classed as a danger to society, and Roch was sentenced to 2 years prison with 3 years probation and transferred to Orssonville Detention Centre in Quebec. During his prison sentence, the group moved to Quebec, renting 4 apartments, allowing them to be close to their leader. The police meanwhile burnt Eternal Mountain to the ground. At this point, one would expect that we've reached the end of the story of Roch Theriault. The sad truth, however, was that Roch's reign of terror was just beginning. Roch Theriault was released from prison in February of 1984 and greeted with open arms by his devout followers. They suggested that they should collectively rent a house in Quebec, but Roch had other ideas. Since the last cabin adventure had gone so swimmingly, he instead convinced them to do it all over again, and on April the 15th, 1984, Roch and his gang set out to Somerville Township in the English-speaking area of Burnt River in Victoria County. Roch, of course, was the only English speaker in the group, and therefore their isolation would be absolute. By May of 1984, construction had started on a new cabin on Lot 4 Concession 5, a small patch of land which upon they built a cabin, kitchen, bakery, maple sugar shack, smokehouse, root cellar and a stone sanctuary for worship. Roch designed and built a sawmill from old machine parts and a horse-drawn watermill. It all sounds so idyllic, but the reality was far from it. Roch established a hierarchy amongst his wives, and Maurice, who had never fully given into the group, still tagging along for her husband's sake, was bottom of the pile. Roch forbid Jacques from sleeping with her, cast her out to a separate hut, encouraged Jacques to beat her, and convinced the group that a birthmark that she had resembled the mark of the devil. Despite setting up a somewhat self-sufficient little enclave, the group still needed the support of the government to fully sustain itself. However, Victoria County classified their household as a company rather than a family, and this left the group meeting a severe shortfall in funding. Instead, they took to shoplifting, stitching special pockets inside winter coats to aid in the job. On January the 31st, 1985, police caught Jacques shoplifting in the nearby town of Lindsay, and later tracked Gabrielle, Claude and Nicole doing the same. Between them, the group had over $430 worth of produce in their specially made pockets, and they were banned from ever setting foot in Lindsay again. Instead, they began selling fruit and pastries cooked in their bakery in a small pop-up shop by the roadside. This actually worked out reasonably well for the group, and Roch officially established them as a company, naming them the Anthill Kids, for the way in which the group worked together like a nest of ants. Despite their limited success as bakers, however, Roch once again began drinking heavily, and the spiral into violence and destruction started once again. His tirade against his followers included making the women nude wrestle. He forced the men to stand in the centre of a circle of the women whilst they punched and kicked them. Roch routinely punched and whipped them, hit them with hammers and urinated on them. If any of them sustained any severe injuries, he forbid them from visiting the hospital. After his bouts of violence, Roch would cry and beg God to stop using him as a tool to implement the Lord's justice. In a letter from Solange, we can see just how effective this was for his followers, who were now so downtrodden they actually felt the beatings atoned them for their sins. Good day, Moses, my master. I would have liked to have talked to you yesterday evening, but I think it is preferable to write these things down rather than saying them for fear of talking too much. I am going to talk to you about the last fit of anger that your master exercised through you. I really believe that what you did doesn't come from you, but from someone much higher. For my part, I really believe that you were possessed by a very powerful spirit. That's what I saw in what you did. The throwing of the knife, the rifle shot, the harm done to Mammy. Her eyes saw things that went beyond them. My body is very afraid of all of these things. I understand it very well because of the law of death in which it exists, but within myself I am well. I am very well and very happy to belong to a real master who himself belongs to the only real master of life. Love, Rachel. On the morning of January the 26th, 1985, Gabrielle left her 5-month-old infant outside in -10-degree temperatures, lying in a wheelbarrow where he promptly froze to death. Roch had previously stated how much he had hated the child and how it had been marked by the devil. Bizarrely, the county coroner Al Lackett judged the baby to have died from SIDS. However, the local Children's Aid Society took note of this and began watching the compound very closely. In October of 1985, Maurice Grenier had finally seen enough. She demanded to leave, and as the only woman of the group not married to Roch, this was not seen as any real problem as far as he was concerned. He allowed her to go on the condition that she leave behind her eldest daughter, who Roch had lined up as his next wife, and she agreed, turning tail and booking it out of there with her 2-year-old infant, leaving both her daughter and husband behind. She wasn't done, however, and as soon as she found her bearings in the outside world, she hired a lawyer to regain custody of the daughter she had left behind. She testified to the awful conditions they were living in on the commune, and the Children's Aid Society stepped in, removing all the children, once again sending them off to foster homes throughout Canada. Now in the outside world, the children told of horrific violence and abuse against them carried out by Roch, including depriving them of sleep, food and education. Roch would hold blood sacrifices in front of them, killing a goat and smearing himself in its blood, and sexual abuses which, frankly, do not need repeating. All this was done in the aid of Roch's sexual instruction. The courts ordered an independent assessment be made on the Anthill kids, and when Dr. Raoul Huneau and Dr. Martin Milkovich visited the group, Roch greeted them with his most charming smile. When they handed in their 300-page report, it actually championed Roch as an alternative living pioneer, accused the government of persecution against the French-speaking population, and suggested the children to be returned immediately. Fortunately, the court saw through all of this and rejected the report, and on October the 26th, 1987, it ruled Roch as a manipulative despot, that the independent papers submitted by the psychologists were not objective and showed signs of positive prejudice, and removed parentage rights from all members of the group for the children that were now in foster care. During this time, Roch had met the Latter-day Saints branch president and forensic psychiatrist Jess Grossbeck. Originally attracted to the concept of Mormonism due to their views on polygamy, he spoke regularly and formed a close relationship with Grossbeck, discussing their alternative views on alternative living and theology. And still, back at home, the violence grew worse. As hinted at in the earlier letter from Solange to Roch, he took to acts of ceaseless barbarity. He broke Jacques' ribs with an axe, burnt Nicole's stomach and Josie's back with a blowtorch. He beat a 3-month pregnant Nicole, causing her to miscarry, and he shot her in the shoulder with a .303 caliber rifle. He broke Giselle's ribs with a pair of steel-toed boots, sliced Claude's arms open with shards of glass, pulled 11 of his teeth with a pair of pliers, and had one of his wives break Claude's legs with a sledgehammer. He eventually ordered Claude to wrap a rubber band around his testicles, and when this caused obvious side effects, he castrated him, cauterizing the wound with a piece of hot iron. At one point, he even took a vote for stoning Claude to death. However, the vote failed, much to Roch's dismay. He tossed a hunting knife into Giselle's leg, causing a deep gash in her thigh, and when it clotted, he filled the wound with olive oil, salt and spruce gum to keep away infection. Roch was quite the man of medicine, and he demonstrated this further when in the fall of 1988, Solange fell ill. Roch diagnosed her with some kind of kidney ailment and suggested immediate surgery. He cleared off the bakery table, made her strip naked, gave her an enema of molasses, oil and water, and then cut open her stomach, removing a random slice of flesh in the process. He then ordered Gabrielle to stitch the wound and declared her cured. By morning, Solange had died of peritonitis, a fatal leaking of her digestive fluids into her abdominal cavity. Surprisingly, this failure did actually affect Roch, and he ordered Jacques to shoot him, as well as attempting to overdose on Tylenol. Unfortunately, he failed at this too, and on October 16, 1988, he met up with Dr. Jess Groesbeck, his new Mormon contact. He told the doctor that Solange had died. However, in this version of events, it was from a spontaneously erupting vein rather than Roch's failed surgical hash, and Groesbeck reassured him that this was not his fault. Then things got a little weird. Roch told Groesbeck that he was his guide, as conveyed to him by God. He told him that he had seen visions in dreams of Solange inside himself, and images of Solange taking shape from his semen. However they managed to come up with the next conclusion is beyond any sane person's comprehension, but the pair decided that this had to mean that Roch was in fact now pregnant with the dead Solange, and that he was to give her a spiritual rebirth. Roch immediately arranged for a marriage to be concluded between him and the dead Solange, and dressed in his best costume jewellery, he ordered the exhumation of Solange's grave on the commune's land. He then drilled a hole into Solange's skull and masturbated into it. He reburied her and convinced himself that this whole macabre affair would bring her back to life. Possibly through fear of further desecration, Giselle told Roch that it was Solange's wish to be cremated, and so Roch once again ordered her to be exhumed. He took one of her ribs, which he wrapped in a sheath of leather and kept upon his person from then on, and the group burnt her remains. Not content with just the one rib, however, Roch filled a small jar with ashes and olive oil and kept that too, masturbating into the jar at times to ensure the rebirth was on track. It appears as if things were finally falling apart upstairs to a point of non-function for Roch, and in reality things were falling apart equally as fast. Roch visited Groesbeck once again and entrusted his 2-year-old son to his care in fear that the Children's Aid Society might take him away. Groesbeck argued with Roch about his treatment of his wives, and the pair parted ways on poor terms, though the child was left in the care of Groesbeck regardless. During the winter of 1988 and 1989, Josie ran away from the compound, and by the summer of 1989, everything was appearing to be in tatters for the Anthill kids. Roch, however, was not going to go out without a bang. On July 25th, 1989, Roch decided that Gabrielle's aching finger needed surgery. Not content with actually operating on the said finger, however, he took her once again to the kitchen table. He stabbed a knife through her hand, and halfway between elbow and shoulder, he cut her arm to the bone. Gabrielle ran away to a women's shelter, but Roch promptly convinced her to return. He then finished the job on her arm, cutting it off with a meat cleaver. He proceeded to leave it a few days before cutting out the infection and cauterizing the stump with a heated metal bar. Over 2 weeks later, Gabrielle finally took off, and this time she didn't return. She made her way to the hospital and concocted a story that she had been in a vehicle accident. However, police were called and they filed charges of aggravated assault against Roch. On August 19th, they visited the commune only to find the anthill kids had all fled, either to Quebec or back to their families. On October the 6th, 1989, police caught up with Roch, and on the same day, Giselle told police about Solange's death. Roch's reign was finally done. Everyone trialed pleaded guilty, and Roch Theriault was sentenced to 12 years prison, though this was actually reduced to 10 years after the judge ruled he had shown genuine remorse and concern for the victim. Apparently, despite his mental collapse, he still knew how to turn on the charm when it was needed. During his trial, he merely stated in his defence, "If she says I did it, then I did it." Jacques was sentenced to 5 years, Chantal 2 years, and Nicole 18 months prison. Police also pressed charges against Roch for first-degree murder, however there proved to be insufficient evidence to show that it was premeditated, and his lawyers made a deal to settle for a charge of second-degree murder if no further charges were to be brought against Roch. His final sentence, handed down to him on January 18, 1993, was life imprisonment, due for release in 2014. Roch served his sentence and was denied early parole on several occasions. He wrote poems and made artwork which sold online, and throughout his incarceration, he still took visits from 3 of his wives, Francine, Nicole and Chantal. On February the 26th, 2011, aged 63 years old, 3 years before his release, Roch was found stabbed to death in his cell following an altercation with another inmate. His children, of which there are a minimum of 22 and possibly more, were given to foster families throughout Canada, and presumably they went on to happy lives, including his infant son and heir, who he left in the care of Jess Grosbeck. John Hugh, a member of the Burnt River Council when the cult were active in the region, said of his death, "It was too bad a prisoner had to give justice, because Canada doesn't give justice to people like that." A sentiment which, aside from his 3 most devout wives, will most likely be shared by many.